Looks like we're live.
Okay, so we're going to go ahead and kick off. So this is Greg here and my co-host, and
Hello.
we're going to continue our discussion of the big category is intermittent fasting, but largely focus this week on what's called the fasting mimicking diet. So before we kick into talking about that diet, we had a lingering question from last episode, which was how do you recommend breaking a fast? And Mansal has way more experience with a couple-day water fast than I do. So I'm going to kick this to him to give you his strategies for that.
Sure. Yeah. Well, breaking the fast is a really important part, which is kind of counterintuitive because most people think that so many of the benefits are coming when they're not eating. But as you and I have chatted about, what the fasting really can do is prime the body to rejuvenate when the inputs are provided, the food's provided. And so having, some awareness about the type of food that you're eating after a fast is really crucial. And the reason I emphasize it is because there's a tendency in myself and others to just eat the most palatable foods possible as soon as it's time to eat. And I would really recommend against that. So my go-to methodology is to drink some type of broth, preferably like a bone broth, probably an hour before I eat anything else. So that kind of primes my body with something that's relatively gentle. It's some calories, but it's not overwhelming. Then the next thing that I'll do an hour later is kind of snack on a few things, maybe a few nuts, maybe a couple bites of sauerkraut, but some actual solid foods. And then 30 minutes later, I'll actually have my first meal. And I tend to eat at home for my first meal. And I tend to eat just a pretty, generally healthful diet. Some protein, some animal protein, lean animal protein with some vegetables, cruciferous, some tubers, etc. And for me, that has worked the best. And I've, believe me, gone the other route of getting barbecue with friends, and that did not end well for me. So it's really useful to gently ease your way back into food, even as short as a 24-hour fast.
Yeah, I agree. I think for me, one of the best visuals is I've been a huge Survivor fan over the decades. And, so they're not doing a water fast like you were mentioning, but they're doing something we'll get more into in this call, which is like a sustained amount of low calorie restriction. And so what happens is they're hungry. And when they do get a food reward, they overeat. And what you see is that doesn't agree with them, right? They get sick, their digestive system just really not ramped up to be able to deal with that quantity of food and often the mix of food. So it's super important to keep it as simple as possible and to slowly ease your way back to normal eating. So I don't know, one of my stories, I did a 6-day spirulina fast back probably like 1991, shortly after I got out of the Navy. And so by the end of those 6 days, I was starving. And at the time I worked in a teen shelter with kids, and they were making chocolate chip cookies. And so like my plan to slowly ease my way back with mostly healthy foods went out the window. And I don't think I was punished the way you might have been with the barbecue, but it certainly could have been a smarter way to go about things. So.
Yeah.
All right. So with that, I wanted to just briefly summarize what we did in part one, which was focused really on different, what we would think of as intermittent fasting strategies. Things like time-restricted eating we covered. We talked about alternate day eating, all these things that would fall in that area. So we'll really refer you back to our last Facebook Live event for that. For this one, what we really want to cover is the work of someone named Walter Longo in his book, The Longevity Diet. He's the originator of what's been called the fasting-mimicking diet. He actually owns that term and has patented its use. And when I was at A4M in Las Vegas in mid-December, that was a really featured protocol or strategy that a lot of rejuvenative medicine health professionals are starting to implement in their practices. So I'm going to kick it to Mansal. I know it's not something you've had as much experience with, but is there anything you'd like to just jump in here at the beginning and talk about with that particular strategy?
Yeah, well, I think the most valuable part of the fasting mimicking diet seems to be the increased like compliance, which really is so valuable when it comes to something like fasting, where people are restricting themselves, potentially uncomfortable with their dietary choices and things like that. And so we can wax poetically about all the benefits of fasting, but if people can't actually comply, then obviously there's kind of a disconnect. And so I really, although I don't have a lot of experience myself with the fasting mimicking diet, I see it from a theoretical perspective being super valuable for compliance, but also on a practical level. A lot of biohackers and people within the space of improving their longevity and performance are gravitating towards the diet for basically what I like to call an easy win. So get a lot of the benefits of fasting traditionally, but you don't have to go that far with the discomfort.
Yeah, I would say the same. So my interest in it, I started reading his book somewhere before Thanksgiving, and I had finished it over that Thanksgiving break and came in. And as we talked about the neurohacker office, fasting behaviors were rampant the week after Thanksgiving. And one of the staff was doing actually his diet. We'll talk about a little bit. It's called Prolon, is the food that you would buy to do it. And it was this person's second time through. So having just read the book and then her example in the office, was the top of my mind. So when I went to A4M mid-December and it was the most topical aspect of fasting, it just all kind of is crystallizing that this is a big movement now within medicine, both in terms of application and practice, but it's also starting to be widely studied by a lot of people because it is an intervention, as you said, that tends to be a bit easier to do. So with that, I want to, step back and tell a little bit about Longo's, like how he came to invent that. The diet, which he talks about more in his book, but mentioned in passing when I saw him speak at A4M. So the big picture is Longo works and runs the lab at USC's Longevity Research Center. So he's been doing studies on things to do with healthy aging for, I think at this point, close to 2 decades plus. So as Mansal mentioned, calorie restriction produces lots of good from like a longevity health span perspective benefits. But whether we're trying to fast or live the rest of our life calorie restricted, there's a lot of unpleasantness and downsides to that. So what Longo's goal was to come up with a strategy that gave the benefits while minimizing the harshness or essentially the unwanted, unpleasant effects. And what he eventually came upon was what we're now calling the fasting mimicking diet. And it started out applied in animals. And really, like in a big picture sense, the diet would have a couple core strategies. So the most important one, or one of the, what I would say the 2 most important ones, is you go really low protein. So in his book, he mentions about 10% of protein is the target that they strive for during this 3 to 5 day fasting window when you're on the FMD. Another one is that you're really reducing your calories substantially. So you're going down from about, whatever, say like an average would be 2,000 calories or so. You're dropping that down the first day to about 1,100 and then down to about 800 the next day, basically 2 through 5. The third aspect of the diet is it's plant-based. So the goal is to eat plant-based foods. So lots of vegetables, some complex carbohydrates, and then good fats. And then the last part is the ratio of fats and carbohydrates. And those basically make up the rest. So the other 90% with almost a 50-50 split. So the way that you get there, whether you're getting Prolon or whether you're trying to mimic this diet on your own at home, kind of hack your way into it, is typically vegetable soups, some complex carbohydrates. So, sweet potatoes is a good one to have a little bit. And then foods with healthy fats. So good nuts and olives would be the kind of the crux of the toolbox if you're going to hack your way into it. But the easiest way is to actually buy the Prolon through L-Nutra and do the exact diet that's been studied. So I'll kick it back to you, Mansal.
Yeah, well, I think the again Prolon again with compliance, it's valuable. I've never used it, but I trust Longo's research and
Mhm.
creation of the product. So for people who really just want to just take something that's going to jumpstart you, you don't have to think about it.
Yeah,
I think it's a really good option. But I do really I find a few things interesting with the diet that maybe we can riff on a little bit. One
sure.
is the low protein component, which if anybody who's watching the video has read the part 3 on the mechanisms regarding fasting, they might know that protein definitely modulates certain mechanisms around longevity, like the mTOR pathway. And so I find it interesting that there is evidence, at least in animals, that the fasting mimicking diet can support autophagy within that time
Hmm.
period, even though there is calories coming into the system. And the second thing that I find kind of compelling is that there's a process by which you could eat a considerable amount of complex carbohydrates. Like some experimenters eat 60 to 65 grams a day of carbohydrates and still see, elevated ketone levels. So they're still
Hmm.
getting these kind of cognitive benefits that come from the fasting, even with plenty of complex carbohydrates that provide, nutrients within those
Hmm.
vegetables, etc. So I think it's a interesting nutrient breakdown that's kind of again more of those easy wins.
Yeah, and so one of the things that I liked about Longo's original research and his work, and he touches on this both in his book and I heard him live. But so we all know that fasting promotes some of these cellular and mitochondrial benefits, where basically I guess the simplest way to say it is we start to tear down dysfunctional units within cells or get rid of dysfunctional cells during the fast. And as Mansal mentioned, during the period after the refeeding, we then tend to rebuild better versions of those, like newer, younger versions of our cells. And that's what they found with this diet in animals. And so far in humans, they studied it. There was a 100-person study that they did. And in that study, what they found is huge improvements in things like C-reactive protein, which is a biomarker of inflammation, improvements in our metabolic health, so things like insulin and blood sugar, improvements in waist circumference that tends to be during this almost a reshuffling of what I would think of as shape in the period during and immediately after, where the body tends to disproportionately get rid of a little fat and regain weight a little bit more as muscle. So your body composition tends to have a net positive in the period during and the rebound after, which is for me like a huge thing. So I would say, given the existing research, and we're not going to go into lots of details on it, this looks like a really robust response to something that's a lot simpler than doing a 3-day water fast.
Yeah, and I think that especially for high performers who probably are also interested in maintaining certain physical performance, the
Mm-hmm.
fasting mimicking diet has, at least anecdotally, and it seems that there's some scientific suggestion as well that it does a lot better at maintaining muscle mass and strength.
Mm-hmm.
The specific uh, anecdote that you and I saw with Quantified Bob, he mentioned that he was able to not only lose fat mass,
Mm-hmm.
increase slightly his muscle mass, and then
Mm-hmm.
experience a rebounding effect afterwards. And I that is something, even though I do the extended fast, just
Mm-hmm.
water fast, one of the downsides for me is definitely I'm far weaker after that period, and muscle mass is decreased as well for me specifically. So if there's one thing that has kind of made me think a little bit more about doing the fasting mimicking diet, it's that kind of preservation of muscle mass and
Yeah.
physical performance that I tend to appreciate, because doing a 3-day water fast every quarter means that my regime when it comes to working out kind of like peaks, and then I just kind of start back over, and so I think that's an important note for someone who might not want to do fasting for the sake of losing the physical benefits.
Well, and I guess this is a good lead in. So it's like similar to Quantified Bob, who did his own mimic or hacked version of the FMD. He didn't do Prolon. I did the same type of self-experiment over the last week. And so what I found is I did it for basically 3 days instead of the full 5, but then had a really light 4th day as well. And so for me, my weight went down 4 days after that, but my strength, I worked out every morning except one with weights, and my strength actually, I did better than I had last week in a lot of the lifts. So my strength wasn't negatively affected. So it's still too early to see the rebound because I just came off it yesterday. So I would say from a biohacker perspective, wanting to perform at a high level, I felt like I was able to do that despite being fairly persistently hungry over the last 3 or 4 days.
Yeah, so I'm curious how that persistent hunger influenced your workflow, given, I don't know if you have any comparison to pure water fast, or if it was too problematic. Maybe there's someone in the audience who wonders how that might influence their work capabilities.
No sluggishness at all. So I would say Sunday during, I think, the second football game, I took a nap, but yesterday and Monday at the office were very productive days. So I think for me, there was that like a low level hunger, mostly fairly rapidly after eating something, because my lunch was just a homemade vegetable soup, mostly broth the last 2 days. And so the most challenging time was probably night, after having something modest to eat at dinner. Not necessarily out of boredom, but it would have been an easy time to eat with that sensation of hunger if I wasn't on a fast or on my biohacking of this diet.
Yeah, it does seem, at least for me in my experience, whether it's a water fast or what have you, the evening tends to be a little bit more challenging.
Yeah, so I would say for I'm going to do the actual Prolon at some point, and the way that Longo recommends it varies depending on someone's health. So for someone that's in good shape that wants to just do this as almost a routine tune-up, it could be once a year, once every 6 months. They're doing a lot of at this point studies in people with health conditions, with cancer. And for those people, there's a much more rigorous protocol where you would normally do cycles of this once a month. So you'd be the blue book is a 5-day, but 3 to 5 days is really the window. After day 2, as we talked about in your series of articles and last week, your physiology shifts to where you start to do a lot more of this regenerative and repair type of mechanisms. So the key with this is to do it, once, but then to do it periodically, and the frequency is going to largely be dictated based off your health and desires. I don't think we've got any questions that come in. I don't see any, but.
Well, we're just, no, I'm not seeing anything. Okay. We must be answering things too efficiently.
So one thing we haven't got to yet, but in his book he does mention people he doesn't recommend it for. And one of the things that came out of A4M is a lot of these aren't absolute no's. They're more, if you're going to do it, you should do it under guidance. So some would be an absolute no. One would be pregnancy. But some of the others, like in general, he doesn't recommend people that are older than 70 or frail doing it. And part of the reason, in one of their initial studies in mice, what they found is that the older mice in the study, which the mouse, I guess, equivalent in age was about a 70-year-old human, tended to get, I guess, consistently more dramatic negative effects from a prolonged FMD than the younger mice. And by a negative effect, more of them died in the period immediately coming off it. So what they eventually found was if they reduced that FMD period to about 3 days, that tended to vanish. So his general recommendation in his book is for older people, frail people, to not do this. But the truth is, it's probably possible to do it under supervision, and you would want to do it a lot shorter. Like, more is not always better in these fasting approaches. Sometimes a quicker one that's for someone of a leaner body or a more frail nature would probably be a much more prudent way to start. So
yeah, I think zooming out, I don't have too many specifics to add, but I think zooming out, it's important for people just to kind of consider what fasting is and why it's beneficial. I mean, it is kind of a catabolic activity that's done for us in the Western world because we have an abundance of anabolic, food all over the place. And so with that very kind of basic understanding, just knowing oneself and where one is in terms of, is my immune system compromised? Mm-hmm. Is some other chronic issue, troubling me right now? Something like, that's already negatively affecting a person. I think it really makes sense to kind of put that into context, So there's plenty of people who are under 70 who might have some type of condition where it really doesn't seem like a good idea for them to fast. And I'd say probably listen to that. So just kind of be mindful of where people's body is, where people's health is, because again, this is a process by which we're adding stress to our system.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It's very important because I think, when we talk about these studies he's doing, in general, they're controlling a lot of things. So you always want to make sure you have ample time to sleep, that you're not going ridiculously overboard on exercise or doing these other things that could be additive stresses when you're going to undertake a fast or something that's, in this case, a fasting mimicking approach.
Yeah.
And, go ahead.
I was just going to say, and I think that also that will fluctuate throughout the experience. So as an example, for me, I tend to have, when I'm on longer water fast, but it could be applied to a fasting mimicking diet as well. I'll have periods at the beginning where I feel good, but I can tell that I check my heart rate variability is a little bit, it's indicating that I'm more stressed out. And then I can also, just decide not to go to the gym in those instances. So I can kind of manipulate my behavior in addition to the fast that I'm experiencing. And I've had experiences where that goes on at the beginning, but towards the end of the fast, as my body starts to shift in its mechanisms for energy and metabolism, my desire to go to the gym skyrockets, and I feel really motivated and really energized to go. So I think there's definitely a component to listening to your body and kind of what's going on at any given time within the fast itself.
Yep. So I guess to summarize, a couple big points. In general, both Mansal and I think that some type of intermittent fasting or fasting-related strategies are, at this point, with what we know about healthy aging, longevity, one of the most important tools in the toolkit. There's lots of different, I guess, then subtypes of what might be thought of as intermittent fasting. There's the one that you can kind of do day in, day out, which we talked about last time, time-restricted eating. And that's one where you're basically eating all of what you would normally eat, but during a smaller window of time. Then there's these things that are much more, what I would say, rigorous or potentially contextually more difficult to do types of intermittent fasting. That could be the 5-2, which is eating normally for 5 days a week and then taking 2 days where you either do a water fast or substantially reduce your calories. So another even more rapid version of that's alternate day eating. So these are just examples of what might be under the intermittent fasting umbrella. Then there's this fasting mimicking diet, which is at this point not been studied for longevity, but in animals for some autoimmune conditions, for cancer, in humans for what we would think of as metabolic issues. It has been studied. And this would be somewhere minimum, I would say 2 to 3 days, ideally 3 minimum to 5 at a maximum. And then the other key point with these behaviors is that you would periodically repeat them. That's part of the idea of this intermittent. And so wherever you decide to start, we would just encourage you, when there's an opportunity in your life that one of these might be an opportunity to fit in and self-experiment, take the plunge. So.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a lot of opportunities for each of us, and I'll just say it doesn't have to be a super inconvenient situation. I know friends who only fast when they are traveling to Asia, for example, and they don't want to eat airplane food. So, try and take the opportunity when there's not a lot of food to just, do a fast if that makes it easier. But whatever someone can do, I think it is really a truly worthwhile practice.
Great. And then just again, to wrap up, the big reasons we're doing this as a biohacking strategy isn't to lose weight or dramatically, change our shape quickly. Really what we've been focusing on is repair and regenerate, because really starting probably by our early 20s, we start to accumulate damage in our cells, mitochondria as well. And this is one strategy that's been shown in animals and to date in humans to really stimulate those repair processes. And in the rebound period after the fast particularly, we tend to also produce what are called stem cells. And so when we grow new cells during the refeeding, we tend to create essentially a more youthful experience for some of our cells. So that's not to say it can't be used to improve shape or other aspects of performance, but even if that's not an issue, there's definitely some anti-aging and health benefits to these strategies. So I think we've got about 1 or 2 minutes left. I'll pass it over to you, Mansal, if you have any parting words. Otherwise, I want to thank everyone that's joined us for this 2-part series, and mention that Mansal did a great job in his 4-part series for our Neurohacker blog. So please take the time and read those if you want to find more about these strategies, how they work, and how to go about starting them.
Yeah, well, I appreciate the kind words, Greg, and I'm glad that I got an opportunity to work with you guys on this. And the only thing that comes to mind is, in this world, we don't have a ton of free lunches, so to speak. I think fasting is one of those really valuable tools that we get to use, where we actually just do less. We don't have to buy anything. We just do less. And it's a great balance between short-term performance enhancement and long-term, sustainable, healthful action. So I'm a big proponent. And if anyone has any questions, please feel free to leave a comment on the post, and I'd be glad to help out.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. We'll see you soon.
Take care.